Welcome back to Physiology. Let's just take 10 seconds. Let everything go. Just give yourself this 15-20 minutes to just be here, focus on physiology. Welcome. I'm so glad you're back. Today, we're talking about the chemical composition of the body. The vast majority of what we're talking about today, I think, will probably be a review, but it's important to our understanding of things as we're moving forward, so we're going to touch base on a couple of these central concepts. Chemical composition of the body. As you know, our body is made up of atoms. Everything is made up of atoms. And we represent these atoms in different ways, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this from chemistry, probably went over it in quite a lot of detail in your chemistry classes. But we often represent an atom this way, and this is the way that we're going to be representing them throughout the rest of this lecture. But as you know, an electron cloud model is actually probably a lot more accurate, because electrons are just bouncing around all over the place. They don't just hang out in nice, pretty rings. Atoms do this very cool thing where they chemically bond. And those chemical bonds are the core of our physiology. They're the core of life. And there are different types of chemical bonds, and we're just going to review those briefly. I'm sure you're very familiar with them. When we're talking about ionic bonds, the central sort of theme of ionic bonds is not shared. Wow. It helps if I give you the right definition. Wow. Having technical difficulties. Donated electron. There we go. That's better. So a great example is sodium chloride. So sodium chloride, when they bond, produce salt, which is something you're very familiar with. And this structure that we're looking at with Na representing sodium, Cl representing chloride, is that electron layers, which is actually really an electron cloud. And you may remember that in the different layers of electrons, the layers need a different number of electrons to be stable and can hold a different number of electrons. That innermost is 2. So if you look at the innermost ring around the nucleus, which is represented by the solid dot, we've got 2 electrons, so that layer is full. Then we go out to the next one, and that's 8. Cool, those are full. Then we go out the next layer, and for sodium, we just have this one little electron here, right there. Whereas chloride has 7 electrons. Neither of them have the full complement of electrons to make that layer stable, but sodium, having only 1, if it comes into contact with chloride, which has 7, what it's going to do is it's going to donate that electron. And remember, electrons are negatively charged. Negative. And so if sodium loses an electron, it loses a negative, then it's going to become more positive. So sodium becomes the sodium ion. Chloride gains another electron, and so it becomes more negative. This is where we get those designations when we say sodium is positive ion, chloride is a negative ion. This is why. This is what's happening, the gain and loss of electrons. And then what this does is this ionically bonds these 2 atoms together. So sodium really, really likes chloride. It's going to stick with chloride because chloride has its electron now. Chloride likes sodium. It's going to stick with sodium because it borrowed an electron from sodium. And so what that does is that allows for the formation of salt crystals, where you have sodium and chloride all bonded together. And we're going to talk at the end of this lecture about what happens and how we get back to this ionic form. All right, ionic bonds. Then we have covalent bonds. Covalent bonds are kind of easier in my mind. Maybe they're not in your mind. I shouldn't make assumptions. But Covalent bonds are when you share electrons. So a really super simple example is hydrogen. Hydrogen only has one electron. But remember, in that first layer, we need two to be stable. And so what hydrogen will do is it won't take an electron from each other. That wouldn't make either of them, well, that would make one of them stable, and one of them, I don't even know what that would do. But what they do is they come together and they share that electron, those electrons between them. And that forms a covalent bond, and you probably remember from chemistry that covalent bonding is much stronger. And this is shared electrons. Lots and lots of things bond covalently. Oxygen, the oxygen that we breathe is actually O2, and it's bonded covalently. So we don't breathe free oxygen, we breathe covalently bonded oxygen. One of the, so nitrogen is like this, carbon is formed by covalent bonds. Methane, not carbon. Oxygen bonds with a very important molecule, drawn here is hydrogen, to form water. So let's see what happens here. This one, the covalent bonding situation that forms water, is particularly important because it forms polarity. So if we have, let's see, should I draw? Let's see. Here's your oxygen. And then get rid of those hydrogens so that we don't get mixed up. And then here are hydrogens. And we know, I'm sure you guys are really familiar with the structure of oxygen. I always thought it looked like Mickey Mouse. But remember, we've just got one lonely little electron in our hydrogens. Oxygen, it's got two here, but then it's going to bond two hydrogens. So just knowing that, you can probably guess we need to get to 8. So how many? It has 6. And these are called valence electrons. Valence electrons are the ones that are in the outer shell. And so oxygen is super stoked to find 2 hydrogen molecules, because what it can do is share with those guys, and everybody's happy. So we put them here and here, and we make our little classic water molecule Mickey Mouse structure. And this is important for a lot of reasons. Water is sort of everything, right? What would we do without water? We would die very quickly. And so this structure where you put the 2 hydrogens and the oxygens together, it causes polarity. So what it does is, over here at the hydrogen ends, a little bit positive, and over here at the oxygen ends, it's a little bit negative. It's a little bit negative over here. And the reason that that is the case is because while hydrogen and oxygen are sharing those electrons, the electrons actually spend more time over in this area. So they spend more time on the oxygen side of the hydrogen atom. So that makes one end of a water molecule slightly positive and the other end of the water molecule slightly negative. And this polarity is really, really important for what we're going to talk about next. So here's an image. It has a lot of different covalent bonds drawn much more neatly and more nicely than I did, and some extra ones that we didn't talk about. Oh, we talked about all of those. So there's the image from your book. Chemical bonds, hydrogen bonds specifically. So we just talked about water, and this is the image from your book of oxygen and hydrogen bonding. So remember that hydrogen is going to share its electron with oxygen, and oxygen is going to share one of those electrons with hydrogen. I didn't draw that. That's an important point, because hydrogen also needs, go back here, a full valence shell. I just focused on hydrogen sharing its electron. I made oxygen really selfish. So oxygen shares electrons, hydrogen shares electrons. And what that does, like I said earlier, is that creates a net positive on one end and a net negative on the other end of the molecule. And this is how water bonds to water, is because you've got a positive end of water and a negative end of water. So this central water molecule, it's showing you those positives and negatives. And this hydrogen right here, that's a little bit positive. So we got a positive. And then this oxygen up at the top is a little bit negative. And as we know, opposites attract, right? So that positive end is attracted to that negative end, and that forms a hydrogen bond. Same thing over here. We're a little bit positive here, a little bit negative here. Boom, hydrogen bond. Same thing, all over the place. We've got our positive here, and our negative here, and our positive here, and our negative here. And hydrogen bonds are how water bonds to water. And water bonding to water is critical to all human life processes. And it's also critical in other parts. This hydrogen bonding is also critical when you take genetics. You'll learn hydrogen bonding is really important to the structure of the DNA double helix. Okay, so super awesome, cool thing about molecules is that they do this thing called chemical reactions. And chemical reactions are how our body carries out all of our life processes, and we're going to talk about this in more detail when we talk about metabolism. But just to remind you, once again, this is probably a review, but on this end of a chemical reaction, we have reactants, and then on this end, we have products. And when we talk about metabolism, we're going to be really interested in what's happening right there. So, water, I mentioned it's the stuff of life, right? This very cool special hydrogen bonding is what allows water molecules to bond to water molecules. Water, pretty much all of our life processes happen in water. And different molecules in our bodies are labeled hydrophilic and hydrophobic. And hydro refers to water, right? This is something that we're probably familiar with. We're talking about water if we say hydro. And it tells you how critical and how important water is to our bodies, that all these other molecules in our body are labeled totally based on whether or not they like water or they don't like water. And we're going to watch a short YouTube video that discusses what hydrophobic and hydrophilic are. This is a short video from 2 Minute Classroom, and it has some really cool animations, better stuff than I can do. So let's check this out.
Today we're discussing hydrophilic versus hydrophobic substances. Let's start broadly and break down the words. Hydro, as you may know, means water. Philic or phil means a strong attraction or affinity for something. A bibliophile is someone who loves books, and philanthropy literally means the love of humanity. Phobic or phobia, on the other hand, means fear of. Common uses are arachnophobia, fear of spiders, and xanthophobia, fear of the color yellow. So hydrophobic means water fearing or water hating, while hydrophilic means water loving. Now let's take a more scientific approach. Hydrophilic substances dissolve in water. These include ionic compounds like salts and polar molecules like alcohols. Most ingredients in any drink are hydrophilic and thus dissolve in water. This is because water is polar and hydrophilic substances break down to be surrounded by water. Hydrophobic substances, however, do not easily dissolve in water. In fact, they repel it. Oils and other fats, as well as non-polar molecules, are hydrophobic. Have you ever seen waterproof fabrics? These use hydrophobic material. These concepts become very important when talking about the cell membrane, or phospholipid bilayer. This membrane has both hydrophobic and hydrophilic portions, and allows our cells to function properly and safely. I'll make a separate video about the awesomeness of the cell membrane and link it below. So that's pretty much it for hydrophilic and hydrophobic. If you have any additional questions, throw them in the comments, and be sure to check out my other videos and subscribe so you don't miss any great content.
So hydrophobic and hydrophilic are based, the names of these substances, or at least the classifications, are based entirely on how they behave in water. Another area, I don't know why I'm not working. All sorts of technical difficulties today. Another area where something critical is defined based on its behavior in water are acids, bases, and salts. And so these different things, acids, bases, and salts, they dissociate in water. So an acid is defined based on how many hydrogens it's going to donate when it dissociates in water. How much of that acid stays in its original bond and how much of it dissociates, donating this positive hydrogen ion, because it has to dissociate to donate, quote unquote, to the water that positive hydrogen ion. Bases, this is the same essentially. How strong a base is based on how much hydroxide it's going to donate. And then salts just dissociate in water, so this is something that you're familiar with. You have the positive and the negative, and they dissociate into ions. And so the pH scale is based entirely on these molecules' behavior in water. If they donate high levels of hydroxyl ions or high levels of hydrogen ions, then they're considered a strong either acid or base, depending on which they're donating. And that's all because of water. So let's go back and think about that. We're thinking about water here as we have two hydrogens bonded to a single oxygen. And that's true. And that's 1000% true. But this bonding, this association, where this water molecule is bonded, I should use the same, over here to this water molecule, and then to this water molecule. If you'll remember, that's based on hydrogen bonds. That situation is very dynamic. So we have this movement happening all the time, the bonding of individual water molecules bonding to each other and then releasing from each other, and then bonding to each other and releasing from each other, and bonding to each other and releasing from each other. And sometimes what happens is that you have, try to use the same colors. So, trying to stop saying so, I promise. We talked about the fact that these electrons are dynamically moving. They're not just stuck in one place. And you can imagine that occasionally what's going to happen is an electron, we'll make it yellow, is doing its thing. It's going here, and it's going here, and it's going here, and it's going here. And maybe it's just going to hang out over here for a while, because electrons they do their thing. They're not, we can't just say that they're going to go back and forth every time, right? So that's going to make maybe this area more negative than it was. And then what that might do, because it's super duper negative over here, is that maybe there's another molecule over here and what's happening with its electrons is the opposite. The same, I apologize. So let's say that maybe that's happening over here too, and this electron's just like, I really am going to extra hang out over here. And what does that do? That makes this more positive. And this happens. And that becomes so positive and that becomes so negative that this hydrogen actually comes over here and makes a molecule that's H3O. This happens all the time. And then over here, what this might be familiar to you. And we tend to think of hydroxyl as associated with base. Or sometimes maybe this hydrogen just gets released. But this thing that's happening naturally in oxygen, it completely balances each other. This back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So our positives and our negatives are nicely and neatly balanced in water. And so going back to the idea of the pH scale, here, when we're talking about acids and bases in the pH scale, what we're doing is we're tipping that balance. So the hydrogen hydroxyl positive negative is balanced where water's doing this dance where hydrogens are kind of hopping back and forth. But if we add more hydrogens or we add more hydroxyls, then we tip that balance. And then that's when we get what we call acids and bases. And our body's balance of acids and bases is critical to homeostasis. And in the next video, briefly go over positive negative feedback and homeostasis.